The wagon lurched to a halt at the edge of the frozen ridge, and Clara Whitmore felt her last thread of hope snap like a winter branch. Behind her lay Iron Creek, the town that had sold her like cattle. Ahead, somewhere in the blinding white mountains, waited a life she couldn't imagine surviving. Her new husband sat silent beside her, this man they called the Ghost, this stranger who supposedly lived on scraps and dust. She had married him 3 hours ago. She didn't even know if he owned a roof that wouldn't collapse under snow, but the choice had never been hers to make. Before we begin Clara's journey into the unknown, I invite you to follow this story to the very end. If you enjoy it, please hit the like button and comment with your city so I can see how far this tale travels across the world. The morning of Clara Whitmore's wedding began with the sound of her stepfather counting coins. She stood in the narrow kitchen of the boarding house, her hands submerged in cold dishwater, and listened to the clink of metal against wood in the next room. Each coin was a piece of her worth, measured and weighed like flour or salt. $20. That's what Elias Crow had offered for a wife. $20 and a wagon of firewood that her stepfather had already sold to the saloon. "You'll be ready by noon," her stepfather called through the doorway. It wasn't a question. Clara didn't answer. Her fingers had gone numb in the water, but she kept scrubbing the same plate over and over, watching the gray soap scum swirl and disappear. Outside the frosted window, Iron Creek sprawled across the valley like a wound that wouldn't heal. The mining town had grown fast and desperate, thrown together with timber and ambition, and it showed in every crooked building and muddy street. Men came here to pull fortune from the earth. Most found only darkness and debt. She had been in Iron Creek for 2 years, ever since her mother died and her stepfather dragged her west with promises of a fresh start. The fresh start had turned out to be a boarding house that smelled of tobacco and unwashed men, where Clara cooked and cleaned from dawn until long past dark. She was 19 years old. She had no money, no family who cared whether she lived or died, and no way out. Until Elias Crow came to town. She'd seen him only twice before the arrangement was made. The first time was at the general store, where he'd stood in the corner like a shadow, so still and quiet that she'd nearly walked into him. He was tall and lean, with dark hair that fell past his collar and eyes the color of winter smoke. He'd stepped aside without a word, and she'd hurried past, unnerved by his silence. The second time was 3 days ago. He'd come to the boarding house and sat across from her stepfather at the kitchen table while Clara served them coffee. She'd kept her eyes down, but she'd felt his gaze follow her movements. Not with hunger like the miners who sometimes grabbed at her skirts, but with something else, assessment, maybe. Curiosity. "She's a hard worker," her stepfather had said, as if Clara weren't standing 3 feet away. "Knows her way around a kitchen, doesn't complain." Elias had taken a sip of coffee. "Can she handle cold?" Her stepfather had laughed. "She's breathing, ain't she? She'll manage." That was 2 days ago. Now it was her wedding day. Clara dried her hands on her apron and walked into the small room that had served as her bedroom for 2 years. Her only dress that wasn't stained or patched hung from a nail on the wall, a simple gray wool that had belonged to her mother. She changed into it slowly, her fingers clumsy with cold and something that felt like grief. When she looked at herself in the cracked mirror above the wash basin, she saw a stranger. Pale skin, brown hair pulled back severe and practical, eyes that had learned not to hope for anything. "You're lucky, you know." Clara turned. Mrs. Brennan stood in the doorway, wiping her hands on her apron. She was the boarding house cook, a woman with kind eyes and a husband buried somewhere in the California hills. "Lucky," Clara repeated softly. "Elias Crow could have chosen any girl in this town," Mrs. Brennan said, "and he chose you." Clara wanted to laugh, but the sound wouldn't come. Any girl in Iron Creek would have been chosen the same way, by poverty and circumstance, not by anything resembling choice. "What do you know about him?" Clara asked. Mrs. Brennan's expression shifted, something uncertain crossing her features. "Not much. He keeps to himself, has a claim up in the mountains somewhere, past the northern ridge. Comes to town maybe twice a year for supplies." "Is he—" Clara hesitated. "Is he cruel?" "I've never heard tell of it," Mrs. Brennan said carefully, "but I've never heard much of anything about him at all. People say he lives like a hermit, say his place is barely standing, say he's half wild from the isolation. She paused. But people say a lot of things in this town, and most of it's horseshit. Clara nodded slowly, half wild, barely standing. It matched what she'd heard whispered in the boarding house, the speculation that had followed Elias Crow's strange proposal. Why would the poorest man on the frontier want a wife? What could he possibly offer her except a slow death in the frozen mountains? You could run, Mrs. Brennan said quietly. Clara met her eyes. Where? The older woman had no answer for that. There was nowhere to run, not in Iron Creek where women without protection were swallowed whole by the town's grinding need. Not in the wilderness, where winter could kill you in a single night. Not anywhere in this brutal territory where survival itself was a luxury. At noon, Clara walked down the boarding house stairs for the last time. Her stepfather waited by the door, dressed in his one good jacket. Beside him stood Elias Crow, looking exactly as he had 3 days ago, quiet, self-contained, unreadable. He wore a heavy coat that had seen better years and boots that were scuffed but well-maintained. When Clara reached the bottom of the stairs, his gray eyes met hers for just a moment before he looked away. Let's get this done, her stepfather said. The wedding took place in the office of Iron Creek's Justice of the Peace, a man named Whitley who performed his duties with the enthusiasm of someone documenting livestock sales. The room smelled of old paper and tobacco. Through the window, Clara could see the main street, where miners trudged through half-frozen mud, and the wind carried the distant sound of the stamp mill crushing ore. Do you, Clara Whitmore, take this man as your lawfully wedded husband? She heard herself say yes. The word felt like it came from someone else's mouth. Do you, Elias Crow, take this woman as your lawfully wedded wife? I do. His voice was low and rough, like he didn't use it often. Then by the power vested in me by the territory, I pronounce you man and wife. No one kissed. No one celebrated. Her stepfather collected his money, shook Elias's hand, and left without looking at Clara again. Just like that, she belonged to someone else. Elias led her outside to where a wagon waited in the street. It was sturdy but plain, loaded with supplies covered by a canvas tarp. A single horse stood in the traces, a gray mare with patient eyes. Clara had no possessions to bring except the clothes on her back. Everything she'd owned in the world had already been packed on that wagon or left behind without a second thought. Can you drive? Elias asked. Clara shook her head. He nodded as if he'd expected that answer and helped her up onto the wagon seat. His hand was calloused and warm through her thin glove. Then he climbed up beside her, took the reins, and guided the horse away from the boarding house, away from the only life Clara had known for 2 years. They rode through Iron Creek in silence. Clara looked at the buildings sliding past, the general store where she'd bought thread and flour, the saloon where drunken men sang off-key every night, the church that had never felt like sanctuary. A few people stopped to watch them go. Mrs. Brennan stood in the doorway of the boarding house, one hand raised in a tentative wave. Clara didn't wave back. She couldn't. At the edge of town, where the road forked toward the mining camps and the mountains, Elias guided the horse north. The wind hit them like a fist. Clara pulled her shawl tighter and tucked her hands beneath her arms, but the cold found every gap in her clothing, every exposed inch of skin. The sky had been gray all morning, and now it darkened to the color of old iron. Snow began to fall, light at first, just a dusting that melted on the wagon seat, then heavier until the world narrowed to a tunnel of white. How far? Clara asked. Her voice sounded strange in the muffled silence. 2 days, Elias said. Maybe 3, depending on the weather. 2 days. 3 days. Clara tried to imagine spending that long in the cold, sleeping on frozen ground, eating whatever meager supplies Elias had packed. She tried to imagine arriving at some half-collapsed cabin on a barren ridge, tried to picture the rest of her life unfolding in isolation and hunger. Is your homestead large? She asked, mostly to break the silence. Elias was quiet for a long moment. Then he said, Large enough. Do you have neighbors? No. How do you She stopped, unsure how to ask the question. How do you survive? How do you live out here alone? How do you stay human? I manage, Elias said simply. The conversation died. They rode on through the falling snow, the wagon creaking and swaying over the rough road. The mountains rose around them like the walls of a prison, dark pines clinging to steep slopes, rocky outcrops jutting through the white. Clara had never been this far from town. She'd never seen country so wild and empty. As the afternoon wore on, the temperature dropped. Clara's feet went numb first, then her hands, then her face. She tucked her chin into her shawl and tried to think of something warm. A fire, a cup of tea, sunlight on bare skin. But the cold pressed in from all sides, relentless. Elias said nothing. He sat beside her, solid and still, his hands steady on the reins. Occasionally he glanced at the sky or the trail ahead, his expression unreadable. Clara wondered what he was thinking. If he regretted bringing her. If he'd expected someone stronger, more useful. If he'd realized too late that $20 had bought him nothing but a burden. They stopped once, in the late afternoon, at a place where the trees grew thick enough to offer some shelter from the wind. Elias helped Clara down from the wagon. She stumbled when her numb feet hit the ground, and then he moved through a series of tasks with quiet efficiency. He unhitched the horse and led her to a patch of bare ground where she could paw through the snow for dead grass. He pulled a bundle from beneath the wagon seat and shook out a heavy wool blanket. "Wrap this around yourself," he said, handing it to Clara. She took it, surprised by the weight and warmth. "What about you?" "I'll manage." He built a small fire using branches he'd collected from the woods, coaxing the reluctant flames to life with patience and skill. Then he pulled out a tin pot and a cloth sack, and within minutes he had snow melting over the fire. He added something from the sack, dried meat and some kind of grain, and stirred it with a wooden spoon. Clara watched him work. His movements were practiced, economical, no wasted effort, no hesitation. This was a man who'd spent a long time alone, who'd learned to care for himself because no one else would. When the food was ready, Elias filled 2 tin cups and handed one to Clara. She cupped it in her frozen hands, letting the heat seep into her palms. The stew was simple but hot, and it tasted better than anything she'd eaten in weeks. They ate in silence, sitting on opposite sides of the fire, the snow falling soft and steady around them. "Why did you choose me?" Clara asked suddenly. Elias looked up from his cup. In the firelight, his face was all sharp angles and shadows. "What?" "There were other women in Iron Creek," Clara said. "Younger, prettier, women with dowries or connections. Why did you choose me?" For a long moment, Elias didn't answer. He stared into the fire, his expression distant. Then he said, "Because you looked like you wanted to disappear." Clara's breath caught. "What?" "I've seen that look before," Elias said quietly, "in people who've been ground down until there's nothing left but the need to vanish. I thought maybe you'd understand what I'm offering, a place where no one will find you, a place where you don't have to be anything except alive." The words settled over Clara like the snow, cold and inexorable. He was right. She had wanted to disappear. Every day in Iron Creek had been an exercise in making herself smaller, quieter, less visible. She'd scrubbed floors and served food and swallowed every humiliation because the alternative was to be noticed, and being noticed meant being used. "And what do you get out of it?" she asked. Elias's mouth twitched, almost a smile. "Someone to talk to. Eventually." He said it lightly, but Clara heard the loneliness underneath. This man had been alone for a long time, long enough that even a stranger's silence was better than the crushing weight of isolation. They finished eating. Elias packed away the pot and cups, then spread another blanket on the ground near the fire. "You should sleep," he said. "We have a long way to go tomorrow." Clara lay down on the blanket and pulled the wool covering tight around herself. The ground was hard and cold, but the fire kept the worst of the chill at bay. Above her, through the gaps in the trees, she could see a slice of dark sky. No stars, just clouds and endless snow. She didn't expect to sleep, but exhaustion pulled her under like a river current. When she woke, it was still dark. The fire had burned down to embers, and the cold had crept back in, sharp and biting. Clara sat up, disoriented, and saw Elias sitting on the other side of the dying fire. He hadn't lain down. He sat with his back against a tree, his eyes half closed, one hand resting on something beneath his coat. A knife, Clara realized. He was keeping watch. She didn't know what to make of that. Didn't know if he was protecting her from wild animals or from something else. Didn't know if she should be grateful or afraid. But when he noticed her stirring, he stood and added more wood to the fire, and the flames leapt up again, pushing back the darkness. "Go back to sleep," he said quietly. "Dawn's still hours away." Clara lay back down. This time she did sleep, deep and dreamless, the kind of sleep that came from complete exhaustion. When she woke again, pale gray light filtered through the trees. Elias was hitching the horse back to the wagon, his breath steaming in the frozen air. The fire was out, the camp already packed. Clara stood, her body stiff and aching, and folded the blankets while Elias finished preparing the horse. They climbed back onto the wagon and continued north. The second day was worse than the first. The snow fell heavier, driven by a wind that howled through the mountain passes. The road, if it could still be called a road, became little more than a suggestion, a faint depression in the landscape that Elias followed with grim determination. The wagon lurched and swayed, and more than once Clara thought they would tip over. "Should we stop?" she asked, shouting to be heard over the wind. "No," Elias said. "We stop, we freeze." So they kept going. Clara lost all sense of time. The world became nothing but white and cold and the endless creak of the wagon wheels. Her face burned from the wind, then went numb. Her fingers locked around the edge of the seat, frozen in place. She couldn't feel her feet at all. At some point, Elias handed her something, a piece of dried meat. Clara tried to eat it, but her jaw was too cold to chew properly. She tucked it into her cheek and let it soften slowly, the salt and smoke flavor spreading across her tongue. "Not much farther," Elias said. Clara didn't believe him. There was no farther in this white hell. There was only the storm and the cold and the certainty that they would die out here, frozen and forgotten. But Elias kept the horse moving. He leaned forward against the wind, his face set with determination, and somehow the mare kept plodding forward, step by painful step. Then the wagon lurched violently to the side. Clara grabbed for the seat, but her numb hands couldn't hold on. She felt herself sliding, falling, and then Elias's arm locked around her waist, hauling her back. "Hold on," he said sharply. The wagon tilted at a sickening angle. The horse whinnied, panicked, and Elias fought the reins, trying to calm her. For a moment, Clara thought they would tip completely, spilling supplies and people into the snow. But Elias managed to steady the wagon, and slowly, carefully, he guided the horse forward until the wheels found solid ground again. They stopped. Elias jumped down and walked around to inspect the damage. Clara sat frozen in place, her heart hammering, while he checked the wheels and axles. When he climbed back up, his expression was grim. "Axle cracked," he said. "Not broken, but close." "What does that mean?" "It means we leave the wagon." Clara stared at him. "What?" "We can't risk it breaking completely. We'll take what we can carry and go on foot." "On foot?" Clara looked out at the storm, at the knee-deep snow and the wind that seemed strong enough to knock her over. "We'll never make it." "We will," Elias said. He was already moving, pulling supplies from the wagon bed, blankets, food, a coil of rope. "The valley's less than a mile from here. If we move fast, we'll reach it before dark." Valley. It was the first time he'd called their destination anything specific. Clara watched as he fashioned a kind of pack from the blankets, tying them with rope so he could carry them on his back. He handed her a smaller bundle. "Can you carry this?" Clara took it. The weight was manageable, but her arms shook with cold and exhaustion. Elias unhitched the horse and loaded her with as much as she could carry, securing the packs with practiced knots. Then he took the mare's lead rope in one hand and Clara's arm in the other. "Stay close to me," he said. "Don't let go. If you fall, I need to know." Clara nodded. Her teeth were chattering too hard to speak. They left the wagon behind, a dark shape already half buried in snow, and began to walk. It was the hardest thing Clara had ever done. Each step was a battle. The snow came up to her knees, sometimes higher, and the wind shoved at her like invisible hands trying to knock her down. Her bundle grew heavier with every step. Her legs burned, then went numb. She lost track of how many times she stumbled, how many times Elias's grip on her arm was the only thing keeping her upright. "Keep moving," he said, not harsh, but firm. "Don't stop." Clara kept moving. She didn't know how. Her body felt like it belonged to someone else, some distant stranger who was still capable of putting one foot in front of the other. She focused on Elias's back, on the dark shape of him cutting through the white, and she followed. Time became meaningless. There was only the storm and the cold and the brutal rhythm of survival. And then, impossibly, the wind began to ease. Clara lifted her head and realized the snow was falling lighter. The air felt different, less sharp, less cutting. Through the swirling white, she glimpsed something dark and solid ahead. Trees. A wall of them, thick and tall. Elias pulled them into the shelter of the pines, and suddenly the world quieted. The wind still howled overhead, but here beneath the branches it was almost still. Clara sagged against a tree trunk, gasping, every muscle in her body shaking. "Just a little farther," Elias said. He was breathing hard too, his face red from the cold, but his eyes were bright with something that might have been relief. "We're almost there." "Almost where?" Clara wanted to ask, but she couldn't spare the breath. Elias led them deeper into the trees, following some path only he could see. The horse followed docilely, her head low. Clara stumbled after them, half blind with exhaustion. And then the trees opened up. Clara stopped. She blinked, certain she was hallucinating, that the cold had finally broken her mind. Ahead, the ground dropped away into a steep slope that disappeared into mist. But through the mist, impossible, inexplicable, Clara saw a faint shimmer of green. "What?" she whispered. Elias stopped beside her. For the first time since they'd met, he smiled. "Home," he said simply. Clara stared down into the mist. Green. In the middle of winter, in the heart of the frozen mountains, she had seen green. "Trust me," Elias said quietly. He held out his hand. Clara looked at his outstretched hand, at his gray eyes steady on hers, at the impossible valley hidden somewhere below. She thought about Iron Creek and the boarding house and the life she'd left behind. She thought about all the times she'd wanted to disappear. Maybe this was what disappearing looked like. She took his hand. Together they stepped into the mist. The descent was steep enough that Clara had to lean back against the slope to keep from pitching forward. Elias moved ahead of her with sure feet, the horse's lead rope in one hand, his other hand reaching back to steady Clara whenever the ground shifted beneath her boots. The mist wrapped around them like wet wool, cold and clinging, blocking out everything except the few feet directly ahead. Clara's legs trembled with each step. Her lungs burned. But beneath the exhaustion, something else stirred, a flutter of warmth against her face that didn't come from exertion. The air was changing, growing softer, less brutal. "Watch your step here," Elias said, guiding her around a jutting rock. "The path narrows." "Path?" Clara almost laughed. What he called a path was barely a deer trail, a thin line of packed earth that switchbacked down the slope at angles that made her stomach lurch. One wrong step, and she'd tumble into the white nothing below. But Elias navigated it like he'd walked it 1,000 times, his movements fluid and certain. The mist began to thin. At first Clara thought she was imagining it, that the cold had finally addled her brain beyond repair. But no, the white veil was definitely lifting, pulling back like a curtain to reveal what lay beneath. The valley opened below them in shades of impossible green. Clara stopped walking. She couldn't help it. Her mind simply refused to accept what her eyes were showing her. Stretched out in a long basin between steep mountain walls lay a hidden world that had no business existing. Terraced gardens climbed the lower slopes, their dark soil visible even from this height. A stream cut through the center of the valley, its water moving fast and free, not frozen, not even rimmed with ice. And everywhere, there was green. Hardy winter vegetables in neat rows. Fruit trees with bare branches that still somehow looked alive. Patches of grass that hadn't surrendered to snow. "How?" Clara whispered. It was all she could manage. Elias had stopped beside her. He stood with his hands on his hips, looking down at the valley with an expression that might have been pride. "Hot springs," he said. "Underground. They run beneath the whole valley, keep the ground warm enough that winter can't quite kill it." Clara shook her head slowly. She'd heard stories of such places, geothermal valleys where the earth's heat pushed up through cracks in the rock. But those were legends, tall tales told by prospectors who'd spent too long alone in the mountains. They weren't supposed to be real. "The mist," she said, understanding dawning. "It's steam." "Keeps the valley hidden," Elias confirmed. "From above, from the ridges, all anyone sees is fog and rock. They assume it's just another frozen hollow and move on. He glanced at her. That's why no one knows. That's why it has to stay secret. The weight of that secrecy settled over Clara like a physical thing. This wasn't just a homestead. This was a sanctuary. A place so rare and precious that its very existence would bring chaos if discovered. Men would come, the miners and claim jumpers and opportunists who'd stripped Iron Creek of everything valuable would descend on this valley like locusts, tearing it apart in their hunger for profit. Who else knows? Clara asked. No one living, Elias said quietly. My father found it 30 years ago. He was trapping in the high country, got caught in a storm, and stumbled down here by accident. Spent the rest of his life keeping it hidden. His jaw tightened. He died 5 years back. Heart gave out while he was mending fence. It's just been me since then. 5 years alone. Clara tried to imagine it, the grinding solitude, the constant work, the knowledge that one bad winter or one careless word could destroy everything. No wonder he'd seemed half wild when he came to Iron Creek. No wonder he'd wanted a wife who looked like she wanted to disappear. Come on, Elias said, starting down the path again. We need to get you inside before you freeze standing still. Clara followed, but her eyes kept drifting back to the valley. Now that she knew what to look for, she could see more details. A cabin sat near the base of the slope, built from dark timber with a stone chimney that trailed a thin line of smoke. Outbuildings clustered around it. A barn, a root cellar, what looked like a workshop. Fences marked off different sections of land. Everything was neat and well-maintained, the work of someone who took care with what they built. The path leveled out as they reached the valley floor. Clara's boots touched grass, actual grass, winter brown but still soft underfoot, and she almost wept with the strangeness of it. Around them, the air was cool but not cold, like a mild autumn day instead of the killing winter that raged on the peaks above. The horse whickered softly, clearly pleased to be on level ground. Elias led her toward the barn, and Clara followed, her bundle clutched against her chest. Her whole body ached. Her clothes were soaked through with melted snow. She was so tired she could barely see straight, but she was warm. For the first time in 2 days, she was actually warm. Elias opened the barn doors and led the horse inside. The building was larger than Clara had expected, with stalls for multiple animals and a loft stuffed with hay. 2 other horses occupied stalls at the far end, a bay gelding and a rangy sorrel mare. They nickered greeting to the gray, who answered with a tired toss of her head. Help me get these packs off, Elias said. Together they unloaded the horse, working in practiced silence. Clara's fingers fumbled with the frozen knots, but she managed. Elias rubbed the mare down with handfuls of straw, checking her legs and hooves for injury. Finding none, he led her to an empty stall, filled her manger with hay, and made sure she had water. She did good, he said, more to the horse than to Clara. Real good. Then he turned and seemed to really look at Clara for the first time since they'd entered the valley. His expression shifted, concern sharpening his features. You're shaking. Clara looked down at her hands. He was right. She couldn't stop trembling, great shudders that ran through her whole body. The bundle slipped from her grip and fell to the barn floor. Come on, Elias said, his voice gone gentle. He picked up the bundle and took Clara's elbow, guiding her out of the barn and across the short distance to the cabin. The door swung open on well-oiled hinges. Heat rolled out to meet them, blessed, beautiful heat from a fire that had been banked, but not extinguished. Elias ushered Clara inside and kicked the door shut behind them. The cabin was a single large room with a sleeping loft visible overhead. A stone fireplace dominated one wall, its hearth wide enough to cook in. A table and 2 chairs occupied the center of the space. Shelves lined the walls, filled with supplies and tools and books, more books than Clara had expected. Everything was clean and orderly, the space of someone who lived alone and had developed strict habits to combat chaos. Sit, Elias said, pulling one of the chairs closer to the fire. Clara sat. She couldn't have done anything else. Her legs simply gave out. Elias moved through the cabin with quick efficiency. He built up the fire until flames leapt and crackled, filling the room with light and warmth. Then he pulled a heavy quilt from a chest and wrapped it around Clara's shoulders. The fabric was old but well made, stitched in a pattern of interlocking stars. My mother's work, he said, noticing Clara's fingers trace the pattern. She was good with a needle. Was? Died when I was 12. Fever. The simple words carried volumes of old grief. Clara said nothing, just pulled the quilt tighter and let the fire begin to thaw her frozen body. Elias disappeared into a corner and returned with dry clothes, a wool shirt far too large for Clara, thick socks, and canvas pants that would need a belt to stay up. He set them on the table without meeting her eyes. "You should change," he said. "Everything you're wearing is soaked through. I'll... He gestured vaguely toward the door. "I'll be in the barn. Take your time." He left before Clara could respond. Alone, Clara peeled off her wet dress with clumsy fingers. The fabric clung to her skin, reluctant to release her. When she finally got it off, she stood shivering in her thin undergarments, steam rising from her skin in the firelight. She changed quickly into the dry clothes Elias had left, rolling up the sleeves and cinching the pants tight. Everything smelled like wood smoke and sage. She was hanging her wet dress near the fire when Elias returned. He carried an armload of supplies from the barn, which he deposited on the table. Then he busied himself at the hearth, setting a pot of water to boil and pulling vegetables from a storage bin built into the floor. Clara watched him work. His movements were economical, no energy wasted. He chopped potatoes and carrots with a knife that had been sharpened so many times the blade was worn thin, added them to the pot along with dried beans and something that smelled like sage and thyme. The simple domesticity of it all felt surreal after the violence of the journey. "How long have you been preparing for this?" Clara asked. "Having a wife, I mean." Elias didn't look up from his chopping. 2 years, maybe, since I realized I couldn't keep this place running alone forever. Too much work for one person, too much that could go wrong." He paused, and too much silence. "You could have told them," Clara said, "in Iron Creek. You could have explained about the valley, found someone who wanted to come here." "Could I?" Elias finally looked at her, his gray eyes sharp. "You think anyone in that town would have kept this secret? Word would have spread. Men would have come. They'd have claimed this land, torn up the gardens, diverted the springs for mining operations. Within a year, there'd be nothing left but mud and emptied bottles." He was right. Clara knew he was right. Iron Creek had taught her what happened when men found something valuable. They descended like a plague, took everything they could carry, and moved on when the earth had nothing left to give. "So you pretended to be poor," Clara said slowly, understanding clicking into place. "You dressed like you had nothing, acted like you barely survived. Made sure everyone thought you were the last man they'd ever want to trade with." "It wasn't hard," Elias said with a bitter twist of his mouth. "People see what they expect to see. I wore old clothes and kept quiet, and they decided I was barely getting by. No one ever asked questions. No one cared enough to wonder why I only came to town twice a year or where I went when I left." Clara thought about her stepfather's contempt, about the way people in Iron Creek had talked about Elias Crow, the ghost of the ridge, the hermit who probably ate rats and slept in a cave. The carefully constructed lie had worked perfectly. "But you needed help," Clara said. "Eventually." "Eventually," Elias agreed. He added the vegetables to the pot and gave it a stir. "My father and we managed together, but after he died," he shrugged. "There's only so much one person can do. The gardens need constant tending, the fences need repair, animals need care, and if something happened to me, if I got sick or injured, there'd be no one to keep things running. The valley would go to waste." "So you bought a wife." The words came out harsher than Clara intended. Elias flinched slightly, then nodded. "Yeah, I bought a wife. I had money saved, enough to make an offer that would be hard to refuse. I chose someone who looked like they had no other options, someone who might be desperate enough to disappear into the mountains with a stranger." His voice softened. "Someone who might understand what I was offering, not comfort exactly, but safety, a place to be." Clara wrapped the quilt tighter around herself. "And what if I can't do it? What if I'm not strong enough for this life?" "Then we'll figure it out together," Elias said simply. "I'm not expecting you to become a mountain woman overnight. I'm just asking you to try." The stew bubbled, filling the cabin with savory steam. Elias ladled it into 2 bowls and brought them to the table. Clara joined him, sitting across from him like they'd done this 100 times before. The food was simple but well-seasoned, the vegetables tender, the broth rich with herbs. Clara ate slowly, feeling warmth spread through her body from the inside out. They ate in silence. Outside, dusk was falling, painting the valley in shades of gray and purple. Through the cabin's single window, Clara could see the mist rising again, a protective veil drawing across the valley like a blanket. "How does it work?" Clara asked. "The hot springs. How do they keep everything warm?" Elias set down his spoon. "There's a main spring up the valley where the water comes out hot enough to scald. It feeds into a network of channels my father built. Diverted the flow so it runs beneath the garden terraces, warming the soil. Some of it pools in shallow basins that release heat into the air. The rest flows into the stream and eventually disappears underground again." He gestured toward the window. "That mist you see? That's the warm air meeting cold. It happens every evening when the temperature drops. By morning, it'll be thick enough that you can't see 10 feet. And no one's ever found it? Not in 30 years. The valley sits in a fold of the mountains that doesn't lead anywhere. No passes, no easy routes. The only way in is down that slope we just came from, and unless you know exactly where to start the descent, you'll miss it completely." Elias's expression hardened. "My father checked. He spent years making sure, even marked false trails in other directions to lead people away." Clara absorbed this. The level of planning, of paranoia even, spoke to just how precious this valley was, and how fragile. One careless moment, one stranger with sharp eyes, and it would all be over. "What do you do when you need supplies?" Clara asked. "You can't grow everything." "Twice a year I load a wagon and head to Iron Creek," Elias said. "I trade vegetables and herbs, sometimes firewood. Tell people it's all I managed to scavenge from my poor excuse for a homestead. They believe it because they want to believe it. Then I buy salt, flour, coffee, things I can't produce here, tools if I need them. And I leave before anyone gets curious." "And now?" Clara asked. "Now that you have a wife, how does that change things?" Elias was quiet for a moment. "It means I don't have to go alone anymore. It means someone else knows the truth. It means—" He paused, searching for words. "It means the valley has a chance to survive after I'm gone. If something happens to me, you'll know how to keep it running, how to protect it." The responsibility of that settled over Clara like a weight. This wasn't just about being a wife or learning to tend a garden. Elias was asking her to become a guardian, a keeper of secrets, to care for this hidden world as fiercely as he and his father had. "I don't know if I can do that," Clara admitted. "You're still alive, aren't you?" Elias said. "You survived the boarding house. You survived the journey here. That's more than some people could manage." Clara thought about the wagon abandoned on the mountain, about the moment she'd almost fallen, about the endless cold that had tried to grind her into nothing. She'd survived. Barely. But she had. They finished eating in silence. Elias collected the bowls and washed them in a basin of heated water, his movements methodical. Clara stood and moved to the window, looking out at the darkening valley. Lights appeared in the distance. Elias must have lanterns set up in the outbuildings for evening chores. "The loft is yours," Elias said behind her. "There's a proper bed up there, mattress stuffed with straw and wool. I'll sleep down here by the fire." Clara turned. "You don't have to—" "I do," Elias said firmly, "at least until you've had time to settle. This isn't a real marriage, Clara. Not yet. Maybe not ever, if that's what you decide. But you've had enough forced on you for one lifetime. I'm not adding to it." The kindness in his words made Clara's throat tight. She nodded, not trusting herself to speak. The loft was accessed by a sturdy ladder built into the wall. Clara climbed it carefully, her tired muscles protesting every rung. The space under the eaves was small but cozy, with a real bed. The first Clara had seen in 2 years that wasn't a thin pallet on a boarding house floor. A patchwork quilt covered the mattress, and a small trunk sat at the foot of the bed. Clara collapsed onto the mattress and thought she'd fall asleep immediately. But sleep wouldn't come. Her body was exhausted, but her mind raced, turning over everything that had happened. The wedding, the journey, the valley. Elias and his careful secrets, the impossible green in the heart of winter. Below, she could hear Elias moving around the cabin, banking the fire and preparing his own bedroll. The sounds were oddly comforting, proof that she wasn't alone in this strange new world. Eventually, Clara slept. She woke to morning light filtering through gaps in the cabin's roof boards and the smell of coffee. For a moment, she couldn't remember where she was. Then it all came rushing back. The valley, the cabin, the man who'd brought her here. Clara climbed down the ladder to find Elias already dressed and moving around the cabin. He'd set coffee on the table along with bread and butter. When he saw her, he nodded toward the food. "Eat, then I'll show you around." The bread was dense and nutty, the butter rich. Clara ate slowly, letting the coffee chase away the last cobwebs of sleep. Through the window, she could see the valley in full daylight. The mist had settled low to the ground, pooling in the hollows, but above it the sky was clear and pale blue. After breakfast, Elias led her outside. The morning air was cool but not painful, like early autumn instead of deep winter. Clara breathed it in, marveling at the difference from the brutal cold on the mountain slopes. "First thing you need to understand," Elias said, "is that everything here works on cycles. The hot springs are constant, but the seasons still matter. Winter vegetables now, summer crops when the weather turns. We preserve everything we can, drying, salting, storing in the root cellar. Nothing gets wasted." He walked her through the gardens, pointing out different terraces. Kale and chard grew in neat rows, their leaves dark green and healthy. Brussels sprouts clustered on thick stalks. In a protected corner, covered frames sheltered more delicate plants. "Lettuce and spinach," Elias explained. "They can handle cold, but they need protection from wind. Those frames trap heat during the day, keep them from freezing at night." Clara knelt beside one of the frames and peered inside. The lettuce was perfect, crisp and green. She couldn't believe such a thing could exist in March, in the mountains, while snow still buried the world above. They moved on to the barn, where Elias introduced her properly to the other horses. The bay gelding was named Ash, the sorrel mare Ruby. Both were friendly, nosing at Clara's hands looking for treats. "They're good animals," Elias said, running a hand along Ash's neck. "Strong enough for heavy work, smart enough not to panic in rough country. I bred Ruby myself, out of a mare my father kept." Beyond the barn was the root cellar, dug deep into the hillside and lined with stone. Inside, the temperature was cool and constant. Shelves held jars of preserved vegetables, smoked meat, wheels of cheese wrapped in cloth. Bins contained potatoes, carrots, turnips, onions. There was enough food here to last through 2 winters, maybe 3. "My father's rule," Elias said, "always keep 2 years' worth of supplies. That way, if one harvest fails, we don't starve." Clara thought about Iron Creek, where people lived hand to mouth, where a bad winter meant death for those without money or connections. This valley was the opposite of that desperation. This was security built layer by patient layer, year after year. The workshop was last. It was a small building filled with tools, saws and hammers, planes and chisels, everything needed to build and repair. A half-finished chair sat on the workbench, its joints carefully fitted. "I make furniture in winter," Elias said, almost sheepish. "Gives me something to do when the weather's too rough for outside work. I'm not great at it, but it passes the time." Clara looked at the chair. The joints were clean and tight, the proportions balanced. It was good work, the kind that took patience and attention to detail. "It's beautiful," she said. Elias shrugged, uncomfortable with the praise. "It's functional." They walked back toward the cabin, following a path that ran alongside the stream. The water moved fast over smooth stones, its surface steaming slightly in the cool air. Clara stopped to dip her fingers in. The water was warm, not hot enough to burn, but definitely warm. "This is the main channel," Elias said. "It runs the length of the valley before it goes underground again. In summer we can swim in the pools upstream." He paused. "My mother used to wash clothes there, said it was better than any washboard." Clara tried to imagine it. Summer in this valley, swimming in warm water while mountains rose white and cold all around. It seemed like something from a dream. They returned to the cabin as the sun climbed higher. Elias showed Clara the basics, where food was stored, how to work the cook stove, where to find clean water. He explained the daily rhythms, morning chores, afternoon work in the gardens or workshop, evening chores, then supper, and whatever task needed doing before bed. "It's a lot of work," he admitted. "But it's honest work, and it's yours as much as mine now." Clara nodded. She was beginning to understand the shape of this life. It was hard, certainly, demanding, but there was a cleanness to it that the boarding house had never offered. Here, you worked for yourself, for your own survival. The fruits of your labor fed you, sheltered you, kept you safe. No one could take it away as long as you protected the secret. Over the next 3 days, Clara learned the valley's routines. Elias was a patient teacher, showing her how to harvest vegetables without damaging the plants, how to collect eggs from the chickens that scratched around the barn, how to milk the 2 goats that provided butter and cheese. He taught her to read the weather by watching the mist patterns, to check the hot spring channels for blockages, to mend fence where deer had pushed through. The work was physical and exhausting. Clara's muscles ached in new ways every night. Her hands blistered, then calloused. But she found she didn't mind. There was a satisfaction in learning these skills, in becoming useful. And slowly, carefully, she began to talk to Elias. It started small. Questions about the valley, about his father, about the careful systems that kept everything running. Elias answered each question with more words than Clara expected, as if her curiosity had opened something in him that had been locked shut for too long. One evening, as they sat by the fire mending harness, Clara asked, "Do you ever miss it? The world outside?" Elias was quiet for a long moment, his hands working leather with practiced ease. "Sometimes," he admitted, "not the towns, not the people, but the idea of it, maybe. The possibility of something different. But you stay." "I stay." He met her eyes. "This valley is the only place I've ever felt like I belonged. My father felt the same way. It's not perfect. It's isolated and demanding and sometimes lonely enough to drive you mad. But it's ours. It's real. And that matters." Clara understood that better than she would have a week ago. In Iron Creek, she'd been a ghost, invisible except when someone needed her labor. Here, in this hidden valley, she was beginning to feel solid, real. On the 4th morning, Clara woke to find snow falling outside. Thick, heavy flakes that would have meant death on the mountain slopes. But here in the valley, the snow melted as soon as it touched the warm ground, turning to slush and then to water that fed the stream. She found Elias in the barn, checking on a fence post that had worked loose during the night. He looked up when she entered, and something in his expression had shifted. Relief, maybe. Or approval. "You're still here," he said. Clara almost laughed. "Where else would I be?" "I don't know. I thought maybe you'd wake up one morning and decide this was all too strange, too hard, that you'd rather take your chances back in town." Clara shook her head. "Iron Creek has nothing for me. It never did." She paused, choosing her words carefully. "But this place, I think I could build something here, if you'll let me." Elias set down his tools. His gray eyes were steady on hers. "I'm not just letting you, I'm asking you." They stood in the quiet barn, snow falling silently outside, the valley's warmth holding winter at bay. Clara thought about the woman she'd been a week ago, scared, desperate, half dead from grinding misery. That woman had wanted to disappear. This woman, the one standing in a hidden valley with dirt under her nails and calluses forming on her palms, this woman wanted to stay. "Then I will," Clara said simply. And for the first time since she'd arrived, Elias Crow smiled. Not a bitter twist of his mouth, but a real smile that softened his hard features and made him look years younger. "Good," he said, "because there's a lot of work to do before spring." They worked through the morning together, mending fence and clearing drainage channels. The snow continued to fall, creating a strange contrast. White flakes drifting down from a gray sky while green things grew beneath. By noon, the valley floor was covered in a thin layer of slush that would be gone by evening. As they walked back to the cabin for the midday meal, Clara realized she was no longer counting the days since she'd left Iron Creek. She was counting the things she'd learned, the skills she'd gained, the small victories of survival and adaptation. The valley was keeping its promise. It was giving her a place to be. And slowly, carefully, she was beginning to believe she deserved it. 2 weeks passed before Clara found the letters. She'd been searching the loft for an extra blanket. The nights were still cold, even with the valley's warmth, when her hand brushed against something wedged between the mattress and the wall. A wooden box, small and plain, with a simple latch that opened easily under her fingers. Inside lay a stack of letters tied with faded ribbon, their edges yellowed with age. Clara hesitated, knowing she was intruding on something private, but curiosity won out. She untied the ribbon and unfolded the first letter, her eyes scanning the careful handwriting. My dearest Thomas, it began, the valley is more beautiful than you described. I wake each morning and cannot believe this paradise is real, that we have been given such a gift. Our son grows stronger every day. He has your eyes, your steady hands. I think he will be a good guardian when the time comes. Clara's breath caught. Thomas must have been Elias's father, and this letter was from his mother, written when Elias was still a child. She read on, moving through letter after letter, piecing together a story she hadn't known. The letters painted a picture of deep love and careful stewardship. Elias's mother wrote about the gardens she was planting, the systems she and Thomas were building to protect the valley. She wrote about teaching young Elias to read, to track animals, to understand the delicate balance that kept their hidden world alive. And she wrote about the fear that haunted her, that someday someone would find them, that the valley's secret would be exposed, that everything they'd built would be destroyed. We must teach him to be invisible, one letter read. When he goes to town, he must learn to be nothing, a shadow, a man so unremarkable that no one remembers his face. It is the only way to keep this place safe. Clara sat back, the letters trembling in her hands. Elias hadn't just chosen to play the role of a poor farmer. He'd been trained for it since childhood. His silence, his careful anonymity, the way he moved through the world without leaving impressions, it was all deliberate. Survival tactics learned at his mother's knee. The last letter was different. The handwriting was shakier, the words more urgent. Thomas, I fear my time is short. The fever will not break. Promise me you will teach Elias everything. Promise me the valley will endure. It is more than our home. It is proof that beauty can exist hidden from greed, that some things can remain untouched by the world's hunger. Guard it well, my love, and tell our son I loved him more than words can say. Clara wiped her eyes. She hadn't expected to cry, but the grief in those final words had reached across the years and struck something tender in her chest. You found them? Clara startled, nearly dropping the letters. Elias stood at the top of the ladder, his expression unreadable. I'm sorry, Clara said quickly. I didn't mean to pry. I was looking for a blanket, and it's all right. Elias climbed into the loft and sat beside her, his movements careful. I should have told you about them, about her. He took one of the letters gently, his fingers tracing the faded ink. My mother was the heart of this place. She understood what it meant to protect something precious. My father found the valley, but she made it a home. She sounds remarkable, Clara said softly. She was. Elias was quiet for a moment, lost in memory. When she died, my father, he went silent. Not completely. He still spoke when necessary, still taught me what I needed to know. But something in him broke. He poured everything into the valley after that. Like if he could make it perfect enough, beautiful enough, maybe it would fill the space she left behind. Did it work? Elias shook his head. No, but it gave him purpose. And purpose is sometimes enough to keep living. Clara thought about her own mother, dead 2 years now from pneumonia that might have been treatable if they'd had money for a doctor. She understood the shape of that grief, the way it hollowed you out and left you functioning, but not quite whole. Why did you keep the letters up here? She asked. Because this was her space, Elias said. She slept in this loft, wrote those letters by candlelight after I'd gone to sleep. My father could never bring himself to move them, and after he died, neither could I. He looked at Clara. But you're here now. This is your space. If you want me to take them— No, Clara interrupted. Leave them. They belong here. Something passed between them then, an understanding that didn't need words. The valley wasn't just land and hot springs and careful agriculture. It was built on the bones of love and loss, on the fierce determination of people who'd chosen to protect something beautiful at great personal cost. Elias helped her retie the letters and return them to their box. They worked in silence, but it was a comfortable silence now, the kind that came from sharing something important. That evening, as they prepared supper, Claire asked, "What happens when someone does get curious? When you go to town and someone asks too many questions?" Elias was chopping onions, his knife moving with practiced efficiency. "I lie," he said simply. "I tell them my claim is barely producing, that I'm thinking of giving up and moving on. I complain about the cold and the isolation. I make myself so pathetic that they stop asking questions because they don't want to hear more. And it works? So far. He scraped the onions into a pot. "But there was a close call about 3 years back. A prospector followed me out of town thinking maybe I'd found something worth hiding. I had to lead him on a 3-day wild goose chase through the mountains before he gave up and turned back." Clara's stomach tightened. What if he hadn't given up? Elias's hand stilled on the knife. When he spoke, his voice was hard. "Then I would have done what was necessary to protect this place." The implication hung in the air between them. Clara didn't ask him to clarify. She didn't want to know exactly what necessary meant, though she could guess. The valley's survival came first. It had to. "Does that frighten you?" Elias asked quietly. Clara considered the question honestly. A month ago, the answer would have been yes. But she'd changed in the weeks since leaving Iron Creek. She'd seen what men were capable of when they thought they'd found something valuable. She'd watched miners destroy land and lives in their hunger for gold. The valley deserved protection, even if that protection came at a price. "No," she said finally. "It makes sense." Elias nodded, relief flickering across his face. He returned to cooking, and Clara set the table, and they fell into the evening routine that had become familiar. But something had shifted between them. The secrets were fewer now. The trust was deeper. After supper, Elias pulled out a ledger from one of the shelves. "I want to show you something," he said, opening it to reveal pages of careful handwriting. "This is 30 years of records. Everything my father and I learned about the valley. When to plant what, which springs run hottest, where the deer paths are, how to read the weather patterns. You need to know all of it." Clara leaned over his shoulder, studying the meticulous notes. There were sketches too, maps of the valley with every spring and channel marked, diagrams of the irrigation system, drawings of plants with notes on their uses. "This is incredible," Clara breathed. "This is survival," Elias corrected. "Without these records, you're just guessing. With them, you have 30 years of trial and error at your fingertips." They spent the next hour going through the ledger, Elias explaining each entry. Clara absorbed it all, committing details to memory. The work was painstaking, but it felt important. Sacred, almost. This was the accumulated wisdom of people who'd loved the valley enough to document every secret it held. When they finally closed the ledger, Elias looked at Clara with an expression she couldn't quite read. "There's something else you need to know," he said, "about why I really went to Iron Creek looking for a wife." Clara's heart beat faster. "I thought you needed help with the work." "I do, but that's not the whole truth." Elias stood and walked to the window, looking out at the darkening valley. 5 years alone out here. It did something to me. Made me start to wonder if the valley was worth protecting if there was no one to share it with. My father spent his last years living for this place, but he died without joy, without companionship. I started to think maybe that wasn't enough. Maybe survival without connection was just another kind of death. He turned to face her. "I went to town looking for someone who understood that. Someone who knew what it meant to be invisible, to disappear. Someone who might want to build something real in a place the world would never find." Clara's throat was tight. "And you thought I was that person." "I hoped you might be," Elias said quietly. "Was I wrong?" Clara thought about the woman she'd been in Iron Creek, exhausted, hopeless, grinding herself away in service of people who never saw her as human. Then she thought about who she was becoming here. Strong, capable, part of something larger than herself. "No," she said, "you weren't wrong." The words settled between them like a vow. Elias smiled, that rare expression that transformed his stern features, and Clara felt something warm unfold in her chest. Not love, not yet, but the possibility of it. The foundation being laid stone by careful stone. The next morning brought trouble. Clara was in the garden, checking the Brussels sprouts for pests, when she heard Elias shout from the upper terrace. She dropped her basket and ran, her heart pounding. Elias stood near the hot spring channel, staring at something in the water. When Clara reached him, she saw what had alarmed him. The channel was running clear and cold instead of warm. "What happened?" Clara asked. "Blockage upstream," Elias said grimly. "Something's damming the hot spring. If we don't clear it, the whole valley's heat system will fail." Clara looked around at the thriving gardens, the green that survived because of the constant warmth. "How long do we have?" "Maybe a week before things start dying. Less if the weather turns cold. Elias was already moving, heading toward the barn. I need to go upstream to the main spring and clear whatever's blocking it. Could take a full day, maybe more. I'm coming with you, Clara said. Elias stopped. Clara, it's rough terrain, steep and dangerous. You don't... I'm coming, Clara repeated, her voice firm. You said it yourself. This valley is as much mine as yours now. I'm not staying behind while you risk your neck alone. For a moment she thought he'd argue, but then he nodded. All right, but we need to move fast. They packed quickly. Rope, tools, food, water. Elias grabbed a heavy coat for Clara and one for himself. Then they set out, following the stream as it wound up the valley toward its source. The path grew steeper as they climbed. The warm water gave way to hot, then hotter still, steam rising in thick clouds that made the rocks slick and treacherous. Clara's lungs burned from the effort and the mineral-laden air. More than once she slipped, and only Elias's quick reflexes kept her from falling. After 2 hours of brutal climbing, they reached the main spring. It emerged from a crack in the mountain's face, water bubbling up from deep underground, so hot it would scald skin on contact. Normally it flowed freely into the channels Elias's father had built. But now a massive rockfall blocked the natural outlet, forcing the water to pool and back up. Damn, Elias breathed. That's worse than I thought. Clara stared at the pile of broken rock. Some of the stones were bigger than she was. How do we move it? Carefully. Elias was already assessing the pile, looking for structural weaknesses. We can't just start pulling rocks out or the whole thing might collapse on us. We need to find the keystones, the ones holding everything else in place, and remove them in the right order. It was painstaking, dangerous work. Elias would point to a stone, explain why it needed to go, and together they'd work to shift it. Some came free easily. Others required tools, pry bars and wedges that Elias used with surgeon-like precision. The heat was overwhelming, steam scalding their exposed skin, sweat soaking their clothes. Hours passed. The pile slowly shrank. Clara's arms shook with exhaustion, her hands bleeding from a dozen small cuts. But she kept working, driven by the knowledge that failure meant the valley's death. This one, Elias said, pointing to a large flat stone near the base of the pile. This is it. Once we move this, the rest should collapse safely away from the spring. They positioned themselves on either side of the stone. Elias counted to 3, and they heaved together. The stone shifted, moved an inch, then another. Clara's muscles screamed in protest. She thought she couldn't possibly push harder, but somehow she found more strength, more will. The stone came free with a grinding crack. The pile collapsed exactly as Elias had predicted, rocks tumbling away from the spring in a controlled avalanche. When the dust settled, the hot water was flowing freely again, surging into the channels with renewed force. Elias laughed, a sound of pure relief. He grabbed Clara and pulled her into a brief, fierce hug. "We did it," he said. "We actually did it." Clara leaned into him, too exhausted to care about propriety. His body was solid and warm, his heart pounding as hard as hers. For a moment they just stood there, two people who'd fought side by side and won. Then Elias stepped back, his expression turning serious. "We should check the channels on the way down. Make sure everything's flowing properly." They descended slowly, stopping at each junction to verify that water was moving through the system. By the time they reached the valley floor, dusk was falling and Clara's legs were trembling with fatigue. But the garden terraces were already warming again. Clara could feel the difference in the air, that gentle heat rising from the soil, the life-giving warmth that made this place possible. "Thank you," Elias said as they walked back to the cabin. "I couldn't have done that alone." "Yes, you could have," Clara said, "but you don't have to anymore." That night, as Clara lay in the loft nursing her blistered hands, she thought about what they'd accomplished. The valley had been saved because two people worked together, because they trusted each other enough to face danger side by side. The isolation Elias had lived with for 5 years was ending. The valley was no longer his burden alone to carry. In the days that followed, Clara threw herself into learning everything the ledger contained. She memorized the planting schedules, the spring maintenance routines, the signs of coming weather changes. Elias taught her to shoot, reluctantly at first, but Clara insisted she needed to know how to protect the valley if something happened to him. "Aim for the center of the body," he instructed, standing behind her to adjust her stance. "Don't try for anything fancy. Just hit what you're aiming at." Clara squeezed the trigger. The rifle kicked against her shoulder, and a tin can 50 feet away jumped and fell. A thrill ran through her, not at the violence, but at the competence. She was becoming someone who could survive out here, someone who could fight if she had to. They practiced until Clara could hit 8 out of 10 shots, until loading and firing became second nature. Then Elias taught her to track, to read signs in the dirt and disturbed vegetation. He showed her how to set snares for rabbits, how to field dress game, how to waste nothing. "My mother knew all this," he said one afternoon as they checked trap lines. "She was a better hunter than my father, said it was because she paid attention to details he missed." "You miss her," Clara said softly. "Every day." Elias knelt to reset a spring trap. "But less than I used to. Time doesn't heal exactly, but it makes the grief manageable." Clara thought about her own mother, about the guilt she still carried for not being able to save her. "Does it get easier? Missing someone?" "No," Elias said honestly, "but you get stronger. That's not the same thing, but it's something." They walked back to the cabin in comfortable silence, their shoulders occasionally brushing as the path narrowed. Clara found herself noticing small things about Elias, the way he moved with unconscious grace, the rare moments when he smiled, the calluses on his hands that matched her own now. She was learning to read him the way he'd taught her to read the valley. Understanding the silences that meant thought versus the silences that meant discomfort. Recognizing when he needed solitude versus when he needed company. It was a kind of intimacy she'd never experienced before, built on shared work and mutual respect. One evening, 3 weeks after the rockfall, Clara was mending a shirt by firelight when Elias spoke suddenly. "I'm going to Iron Creek next week." Clara's hand stilled on the fabric. "Already? You said you only go twice a year." "I need to register our marriage properly," Elias explained. "And there are supplies we're running low on that I didn't account for when I planned the year. Salt, mostly. Some medicines." He paused. "I was thinking you should come with me." Clara's stomach nodded. The thought of returning to Iron Creek filled her with dread. "Why?" "Because people need to see you," Elias said. "Need to believe you're real and alive. Otherwise someone might get curious about what happened to the woman who married the ghost of the ridge. Might come looking." He was right. Clara knew he was right, but the thought of facing her stepfather, of walking through those muddy streets again, made her feel physically ill. "What if someone asks questions," Clara said, "about where we live, about—" "We tell them what they expect to hear," Elias interrupted gently. "That you're surviving but barely, that life in the mountains is hard, that you're making do with what little we have. We wear our old clothes, look tired, complain about the cold. We're invisible again." Clara nodded slowly. She could do that. She'd spent 2 years being invisible in Iron Creek. She could manage a few days. "All right," she said. "When do we leave?" 3 days. That gives us time to prepare." The next 3 days passed in a blur of preparation. They gathered vegetables to trade, the winter-hardy crops that wouldn't seem out of place for a struggling homestead. Elias dug out his most worn clothes and helped Clara distress her dress so it looked appropriately shabby. They rehearsed their story until it felt natural. On the morning of departure, Clara stood in the cabin and looked around at the space that had become home. The books on the shelves, the quilt on the loft bed, the fire crackling in the hearth. She'd been here less than a month, but already the thought of leaving, even temporarily, felt wrong. "We'll be back in 4 days," Elias said, reading her expression. "Maybe 5. The valley will be here when we return." They took the wagon they'd abandoned on the mountain. Elias had hiked up the week before and repaired the broken axle. The descent from the valley was easier than the climb had been, the path familiar now to Clara's feet. But when they reached the mist-shrouded ridge and began the final descent toward Iron Creek, Clara's hand started to shake. Elias noticed. He reached over and squeezed her hand briefly. "You're not the same person who left," he said quietly. "Remember that." Clara held on to those words as the town came into view, the crooked buildings, the muddy streets, the stamp mill's distant roar. She wasn't the same. She'd hauled rocks to save a valley. She'd learned to shoot and track and survive. She'd found something worth protecting. Iron Creek had no power over her anymore. They entered the town in late afternoon, the wagon creaking through familiar streets. A few people stopped to stare. Clara kept her eyes down, playing her role. The defeated wife of a poor farmer, barely surviving in the harsh mountains. Elias stopped the wagon outside the land office. "Wait here," he said. "This won't take long." Clara waited, watching the town move around her. Miners trudged past, exhausted from their shifts. Women hurried through errands, their faces pinched with the constant stress of frontier life. Everything looked smaller than she remembered, meaner, more desperate. Mrs. Brennan appeared in the doorway of the boarding house. For a moment their eyes met. The older woman's expression shifted from surprise to something like relief. She raised her hand in a small wave. Clara waved back, then looked away. That life was over. There was nothing here she needed anymore. Elias returned with the paperwork completed. "Done," he said. "Let's get what we need and go." They spent an hour at the general store, buying salt and medicine and coffee with coins Elias counted out carefully. The shopkeeper eyed them with something like pity. "Rough winter up there?" he asked. "Rough enough," Elias said shortly. "Well, spring's coming. Things will get easier." Elias just grunted and finished loading their supplies. Clara kept her expression neutral, playing the exhausted wife to perfection. As they prepared to leave town, Clara's stepfather emerged from the saloon. He was drunk, swaying slightly, his eyes bloodshot. When he saw Clara, his mouth twisted into something ugly. "There's my souled daughter," he called out. "You surviving up there in the dirt, girl?" Clara felt Elias tense beside her. She put a hand on his arm, a silent plea for him to stay calm. "I'm managing," Clara said, her voice flat. "Managing?" Her stepfather laughed. "That's what they all say before they die." He squinted at Elias. "You taking care of her, Crow? Or you working her to death like the animal she is?" Elias's jaw clenched, but his voice stayed level. "We take care of each other." Something in his tone made Clara's stepfather step back. For all his drunken bluster, even he could sense the danger in Elias when roused. He spat in the mud and turned away, muttering curses. Elias guided Clara back to the wagon. They climbed up without another word and left Iron Creek behind, the town shrinking in the distance until it disappeared completely. Only when they were well into the mountains did Clara allow herself to breathe freely again. Elias glanced at her, concern in his eyes. "You all right?" "Better than all right," Clara said honestly. I'm free." And she was. Whatever chains had bound her to that town, that life, had broken completely. She was going home now, to a valley full of warmth and green things, to work that mattered, to a partnership built on mutual respect and shared purpose. The valley appeared through the mist like a promise kept. Clara and Elias descended into its warmth, and Clara felt something settle deep in her chest. This was where she belonged. This was worth protecting. This was home. The valley welcomed them back with warm earth and the scent of growing things. Clara stood in the garden that evening, her hands pressed into the soil, and felt the heat radiating up through her palms. In Iron Creek, winter still held the land in its grip. Here, life persisted, thrived even. "You were right," she said to Elias, who was unhitching the horses in the barn. "I needed to see it, to know I could go back and not belong there anymore." Elias emerged carrying saddles, his face thoughtful in the fading light. "That man who spoke to you, your stepfather, did he hurt you before?" Clara's hand stilled in the dirt. She'd been waiting for this question, knew it would come eventually. "Not the way you mean. He never struck me, but he made sure I knew I was worthless, that I existed only to work, to be sold when he needed money." She looked up at Elias. "In some ways that's worse than a beating. Bruises heal." Elias set the saddles down carefully. "If he ever comes here, if anyone from that town finds this valley, they won't leave the same way they came. You understand that?" "I understand." Clara stood, brushing dirt from her hands. "And I won't stop you." They held each other's gaze for a long moment. An understanding passed between them, dark but necessary. The valley's survival came first, always. That night, Clara couldn't sleep. She lay in the loft listening to Elias move around below, banking the fire and settling into his bedroll. The sounds were familiar now, comforting. But something gnawed at her, a restlessness she couldn't name. She climbed down the ladder quietly. Elias looked up from where he sat by the dying fire, a book open in his lap. "Can't sleep?" he asked. Too much thinking. Clara sat in the other chair, pulling her shawl tight. Tell me about your father. Not the valley stuff. I know all that. Tell me about him. Elias closed the book, his fingers tracing its worn cover. He was quiet. Even before my mother died, he wasn't much for talking, but he had this way of seeing things, noticing details other people missed. He could read the land like some men read books. He paused, a slight smile crossing his face. He taught me to play chess. We had an old set his father had brought from back east. We'd play every winter night, hardly speaking, just moving pieces and thinking. Do you still have it, the chess set? Elias nodded toward a high shelf. Up there. Haven't touched it in 5 years. Clara stood and retrieved the wooden box, bringing it to the table. The pieces inside were hand-carved, simple but beautiful. She set up the board between them. Teach me, she said. Elias looked surprised, then pleased. All right, but I warn you, my father never let me win, and I won't either. They played until the fire burned to embers. Elias was patient, explaining each piece's movement, the basic strategies. Clara lost badly, but she was learning. And more importantly, they were sharing something that mattered to him, filling the silence with quiet concentration instead of empty words. My mother played too, Elias said as Clara studied the board, contemplating her next doomed move. She was better than my father, though he'd never admit it. She said chess taught you to think 3 steps ahead, to see consequences before they happened. Like protecting the valley, Clara said, moving her knight into what she immediately recognized as a trap. Exactly like that. Elias captured her piece. Checkmate. Clara laughed. I need more practice. We have time. The simple statement carried weight. They did have time, years of it, potentially. Winters by the fire, springs planting, summers harvesting, autumns preparing. A whole life stretched out before them, if they chose to build it. Clara met Elias's eyes across the chessboard. Do you ever regret it, choosing this life? Every choice has a cost, Elias said carefully. I gave up the possibility of living openly, of having neighbors and community, of being known. He paused. But what I got in return, this valley, this peace, this certainty that I'm protecting something worth protecting, that's not a bad trade. And me? Clara asked quietly. Was I a good trade? Elias's expression softened. You're not a trade, Clara. You're a partner. There's a difference. The word settled into Clara's chest, warm and solid. Partner. Not property. Not burden. Partner. They packed the chess pieces away and went to their separate beds. But Clara lay awake for a long time, thinking about partnerships and choices and the strange path that had brought her to this hidden valley. Spring arrived gradually, more suggestion than declaration. The days grew longer. The mist thinned in the afternoons, allowing more sunlight to reach the valley floor. The fruit trees budded, their branches slowly transformed from bare wood to clusters of pale blossoms. Clara threw herself into the spring planting. Following the ledger's careful instructions, she and Elias prepared new garden beds, mixing compost into the warm soil. They planted beans and squash, tomatoes and peppers, herbs that would flourish in the summer heat. The growing season here is longer than anywhere else in the mountains, Elias explained as they worked side by side, their hands dark with rich earth. The hot springs keep things warm enough that we get an extra month on both ends. My father kept records. We can grow things here that people 300 miles south would struggle with. Clara tamped soil around a tomato seedling. Has anyone ever come close to discovering this place? Twice that I know of. Elias sat back on his heels, wiping sweat from his forehead. Once when I was a boy, hunters tracking an elk. They came within a quarter mile of the ridge. My father and I hid in the root cellar for 2 days until they moved on. And the second time? The prospector I mentioned, 3 years ago. Elias's expression went dark. He was smart. Noticed I always left town heading north, started asking questions about what was up in that country. One night he followed me from the saloon. Clara's breath caught. What happened? I led him through the roughest terrain I could find. Took him in circles for 3 days until his horse went lame and his supplies ran low. Finally convinced him there was nothing up here worth dying for. Elias met her eyes. But I came close to making sure he never made it back to Iron Creek at all. Why didn't you? Because he had a wife, a daughter. Elias's jaw tightened. I couldn't make orphans for the sake of my own paranoia. So I gambled that he was too proud to admit he'd gotten lost chasing ghosts. Gambled that he'd keep quiet rather than look foolish. And he did. So far. Elias returned to planting, his movements aggressive now. But it only takes once. One person with the right combination of curiosity and determination. One set of fresh eyes that sees what everyone else has missed. Claire understood the weight he carried. The constant vigilance. The knowledge that a single mistake could destroy everything. She reached out and touched his arm, stopping his frantic digging. You're not alone anymore, she said firmly. We watch together now. We protect together. Elias looked at her hand on his arm, then up at her face. Something shifted in his expression, relief mixed with something deeper, something that made Clara's heart beat faster. Together, he repeated quietly. They finished planting in silence, but it was different now, charged with possibility. That evening, as Clara prepared supper, Elias brought down a crate from the loft. Inside were clothes, women's clothes, carefully preserved in cedar shavings. These were my mother's, he said. I thought, if you wanted, you could alter them to fit, better than wearing my old shirts. Clara lifted out a dress, simple homespun cotton in a faded blue. It was well made, the stitching small and even. She held it up to herself. With some taking in at the waist and shortening of the hem, it would fit. Thank you, she said. This means a lot. She'd want them used, Elias said. Waste was her enemy. She'd hate to see good fabric going to rot. Over the next week, Clara spent her evenings by lamplight, altering the dresses to fit her frame. It was meditative work, each stitch a small act of transformation. She found herself thinking about Elias's mother as she sewed, imagining the woman who'd written those letters, who'd built a life in this hidden valley, who'd understood the cost of protection. One dress in particular caught Clara's attention. It was prettier than the others, made of cream-colored wool with delicate embroidery at the collar and cuffs. A special dress. Maybe even a wedding dress. Was this hers? Clara asked Elias one evening, holding up the garment. Elias looked up from the harness he was mending. His expression went soft. Yeah, she made it herself. Wore it the day she and my father were married. He paused. She wore it every anniversary after that, too. Said it reminded her why she'd chosen this life. Clara ran her fingers over the careful embroidery, tiny flowers and vines, each stitch perfect. I'll take good care of it. I know you will. Clara altered the dress last, working with extra care. When she finally tried it on, standing in front of the small mirror Elias had mounted on the wall, she barely recognized herself. The woman looking back was strong and sun-browned, her hands calloused but capable. The dress fit perfectly, the cream wool bringing out the color in her cheeks. She came down from the loft wearing it. Elias looked up from his book and went completely still. Clara, he said, his voice rough. You look like her? Clara asked, suddenly uncertain. No, Elias stood, crossing to her. You look like yourself. You look beautiful. The word hung between them. Beautiful. No one had ever called Clara beautiful before. Useful, maybe. Passable. But never beautiful. Elias seemed to realize what he'd said. He stepped back, color rising in his cheeks. I mean, it fits well. The alterations turned out good. Thank you, Clara said softly. For all of it. The clothes, the chess lessons, the partnership. Clara, Elias started, then stopped. Whatever he'd been about to say, he swallowed it back. We should check the upper channels before dark. The spring runoff is starting. They walked up the valley together as the sun sank low, painting the mist gold and orange. The hot springs ran higher now, fed by snowmelt from the peaks above. Elias checked each junction carefully, making sure the channels weren't being overwhelmed. This is the dangerous time, he explained. Too much water, too fast, and the whole system can fail. We have to watch it constantly until the runoff slows. They reached the highest pool, where steam rose thick into the cooling air. The water here was too hot to touch, bubbling up from deep underground. Clara stood at the edge, mesmerized by the constant movement, the heat that never stopped flowing. Your father was brilliant, she said, to see all this and understand how to use it. My father was desperate, Elias corrected gently. He'd spent years trying to make a go of it in mining camps and timber operations. Watching good land get destroyed, good people get chewed up and spit out. When he found this valley, he saw a chance to do something different, to prove that not everything had to be consumed and discarded. Is that why you've never married before? Because you needed someone who'd understand that? Elias was quiet for a long moment. When he spoke, his voice was careful. I never married because I couldn't imagine asking someone to share this burden. The isolation, the constant fear of discovery, the knowledge that one mistake could destroy everything. It seemed cruel to trap someone in that. But you asked me. I did. Elias turned to face her, the setting sun catching in his gray eyes. Because I saw in you what my mother had, the strength to protect what matters, even at great cost. And because I was tired of being alone. Clara's breath caught. This was the most honest he'd ever been with her, the most vulnerable. She could see it in his face. The loneliness of 5 years, the weight of responsibility carried solo for too long. I'm glad you asked, Clara said quietly. Even if you didn't give me much choice at first. I'm glad I'm here. Are you? Elias stepped closer. Really? Because some days I look at you and wonder if I've just traded one prison for another. The boarding house for the valley. The valley isn't a prison, Clara said firmly. The valley is freedom, the first real freedom I've ever known. Something in Elias's expression cracked open. Before Clara could process what was happening, he'd closed the distance between them and pulled her into his arms. Not romantic, not urgent, just a fierce embrace between two people who'd been alone for too long. Clara wrapped her arms around him and held on. She could feel his heart beating against her chest, could smell wood smoke and sage and honest sweat. This was real. This was solid. This was a man who'd chosen her not for her usefulness or her silence, but because he'd seen something in her worth protecting. When they finally separated, Elias's eyes were suspiciously bright. Sorry, he said roughly. I didn't mean, don't apologize, Clara interrupted. We're partners, remember? Partners can need each other sometimes. They walked back to the cabin in the gathering dark, their hands occasionally brushing as the path narrowed. Something had shifted between them again, another layer of guardedness stripped away. That night, Clara lay in the loft thinking about choices and freedom and the strange shape her life had taken. A month ago, she'd been nothing, invisible, worn down, waiting to disappear. Now she was a guardian of a secret valley, partner to a man who understood the value of protection, keeper of knowledge that could feed them through winter. She'd found purpose. She'd found safety. And she was beginning to suspect she'd found something else too, though she wasn't ready to name it yet. The weeks passed in a blur of work and learning. The gardens exploded into life as the days grew longer and warmer. Clara learned to identify every plant by sight, to know which insects were beneficial and which needed controlling, to read the subtle signs that indicated when something needed water or had too much. She learned to make cheese from the goat's milk, following recipes in the ledger that went back 2 generations. She learned to preserve vegetables in clay crocks, layering them with salt and herbs. She learned to smoke meat in the small smokehouse behind the barn, tending the fire for hours until the flesh was properly cured. And every evening, she and Elias played chess by firelight. She was getting better. She'd even won once, though she suspected Elias had made a deliberate mistake to give her the victory. But she didn't mind. The games weren't about winning. They were about the quiet companionship, the gentle competition, the slow building of trust. One warm evening in late April, Clara was working in the garden when she heard an unfamiliar sound, the distant crack of a rifle shot echoing off the mountains. She froze, her heart suddenly pounding. Elias was in the workshop. She ran to him, finding him already standing in the doorway, his face gone hard. That was close, he said. Maybe 2 ridges over. Hunters? Clara asked, though she already knew the answer. Probably. Could be prospectors. Elias was already moving, pulling rifles from their rack, checking loads. Either way, we need to be ready. They spent the rest of the day in careful surveillance. Elias climbed to the high ridge and watched the approaches while Clara secured the animals in the barn, ready to hide if necessary. The afternoon crawled by, every bird call making Clara's nerves jump, every rustle in the brush a potential threat. As dusk approached, Elias returned. I saw them, he said grimly. 3 men hunting elk by the look of it. They're camped about 3 miles north, moving parallel to us, not toward us. Should we hide? Not yet. As long as they keep that direction, they'll miss the valley completely. Elias set the rifle by the door. But we watch, all night if we have to. They took turns through the night, one sleeping while the other kept vigil. Clara's shift was midnight to dawn. She sat by the window with the rifle across her lap, watching the mist-shrouded darkness for any sign of movement. The valley was utterly quiet except for the constant whisper of the stream and the occasional call of a nightbird. She thought about what would happen if the hunters found them. The conversation they'd had months ago, Elias's grim determination that some threats would never leave the valley alive. She wondered if she'd have the strength to help him, if it came to that. Wondered if she could pull a trigger knowing a man's wife might wait forever for him to come home. The thought made her sick, but not sick enough to risk the valley's exposure. Dawn came gray and cool. Elias relieved her, sending her to get a few hours of sleep. When Clara woke, the sun was high and Elias was making coffee. "They've moved on," he said without preamble. "Tracked an elk east into the next valley. They're gone." Clara's relief was so intense she had to sit down. That was close. Too close. Elias poured coffee with hands that weren't quite steady. "We got lucky. If they'd been heading south instead of east, if the elk had run this direction instead of that—" He stopped, shaking his head. "We can't count on luck forever." "What are you saying?" Elias sat across from her, his expression troubled. "I'm saying maybe we need to think about contingencies. What happens if someone does find us? If we can't scare them off or lead them away? What happens if we have to kill them?" Clara finished quietly. "Yeah." Elias met her eyes. "Could you do it? If it came to that? Could you help me?" Clara thought about the valley, the green things growing, the warm earth, the sanctuary they'd built together. She thought about Elias's mother's letters, about 30 years of careful protection, about the life she was building here, the person she was becoming. "Yes," she said finally. "If there was no other choice, if it was truly them or the valley, yes, I could." Elias nodded slowly. "I hope we never have to find out if that's true." "So do I." The close call changed something in both of them. They became more vigilant, more careful. Elias set up early warning bells on the approach paths, thin wires strung between trees that would chime if disturbed. He taught Clara to move silently through the forest, to track and counter-track, to erase signs of their passage. And they talked more about the future, about what would happen if Elias died, how Clara would manage alone, about whether they should consider finding another person eventually, someone trustworthy who could help share the burden. "My father always said 3 was the ideal number," Elias explained one evening. "Enough to cover all the work, few enough to maintain secrecy. 2 can survive. 3 can thrive. But finding the right person, someone who'd understand, who'd keep the secret, that's almost impossible." "Almost," Elias agreed, "but not completely. You're here, aren't you?" Clara couldn't argue with that. She'd been the right person, even if neither of them had fully understood it at the time. Maybe someday they'd find another. Or maybe 2 would be enough. The summer work intensified as the crops reached their peak. Clara and Elias harvested vegetables daily, preserving everything that came out of the garden. The root cellar filled with jars and crocks. The smokehouse ran constantly. They were preparing for another winter, building up stores that would see them through the lean months. But it was good work, satisfying work. Clara would collapse into bed each night exhausted and aching, but there was a deep contentment underneath the fatigue. She was providing, contributing, building something that would last. One evening in late June, as they shelled peas on the cabin porch, Elias spoke suddenly. "I think we should get married. Actually married, I mean." Clara's hands stilled. "We are married. You bought me, remember?" "That was a transaction," Elias said carefully. "I'm talking about a real marriage. A partnership of choice, not desperation." Clara's heart was beating very fast. "Why now?" "Because we've survived a winter together, worked side by side, protected this valley together." Elias set down his bowl of peas and turned to face her. "Because I trust you completely. And because—" He stopped, searching for words. "Because somewhere along the way, this stopped being about convenience and became about wanting you here. Specifically, you. not just a helper or a guard. You. Clara couldn't breathe. She'd known something was building between them, felt it in the way his hand would linger when he helped her over rough ground, in the way his eyes followed her across the garden, in the quiet moments by the fire when words became unnecessary. But hearing him say it out loud made it real in a way that terrified and thrilled her. "I don't know if I can love someone," Clara said honestly. "I don't know if I know how." "Neither do I," Elias admitted. "My parents loved each other, but I was just a kid watching from the outside. I don't have a map for this." He reached out and took her hand, his calloused palm warm against hers. "But I know I don't want to live without you anymore. I know you make this valley feel like more than just a place to protect. You make it feel like a home." Clara looked down at their joined hands. Something was blooming in her chest, something warm and fragile and terrifying. Maybe it was love. Maybe it was just deep partnership and mutual respect. Maybe there was no difference. "All right," she said quietly. "Let's be really married." Elias's smile was brilliant, transforming his entire face. "Yeah?" "Yeah." Clara squeezed his hand. "But we do it properly, the way your parents would have wanted." They married themselves the next evening at sunset, standing beside the hot spring pool where steam rose golden in the fading light. There was no preacher, no witnesses except the valley itself. But Clara wore the cream wool dress with its careful embroidery, and Elias had washed and combed his hair, and they spoke their vows to each other with the absolute certainty of people who'd fought together and survived. "I promise to protect this valley with everything I have," Elias said, "and to protect you the same way." "I promise to guard our secrets," Clara replied, "and to stand with you no matter what comes." They exchanged rings carved from mountain cedar. Elias had made them in secret over the past weeks, fitting them perfectly to their fingers. When Clara slipped the wooden band onto Elias's work-roughened hand, she felt something lock into place, a commitment deeper than any legal document could create. Elias kissed her then, gentle and uncertain, like someone learning a new language. Clara kissed him back, tasting coffee and mountain air and the promise of a shared future. When they returned to the cabin, everything was different and exactly the same. They still had work to do, gardens to tend, systems to maintain, but now they did it as true partners, bound by choice instead of desperation. That night, for the first time, they shared the loft bed. Clara woke to sunlight streaming through the loft window and the unfamiliar warmth of another body beside her. For a moment, she lay still, disoriented. Then memory rushed back. The vows by the hot spring, the wooden rings, the tentative exploration of touch and trust in the darkness. Elias slept deeply, his face peaceful in a way she'd never seen while he was awake. The constant vigilance had smoothed away, leaving someone younger, more vulnerable. She slipped out of bed carefully, not wanting to wake him. Downstairs, she built up the fire and set coffee to brew, moving through the familiar morning routine with new awareness. Everything looked the same. The books on the shelves, the chess set on the table, the tools hanging by the door. But she felt different, settled in a way she'd never experienced before. "Morning," Elias said from the loft ladder, startling her. His hair was disheveled, his shirt rumpled, and he looked uncertain in a way that made Clara's heart squeeze. "Morning," she replied, pouring 2 cups of coffee. "Did you sleep well?" "Better than I have in 5 years." Elias took the coffee she offered, their fingers brushing. "You?" "The same." They stood in the quiet cabin, drinking coffee and stealing glances at each other like shy strangers instead of people who'd survived blizzards and rockfalls together. Finally, Elias laughed, breaking the tension. "This is ridiculous," he said. "We've been living together for months. Why does this feel so different?" "Because it is different," Claire said simply. "Before we were surviving, now we're choosing." "Yeah." Elias set down his coffee and crossed to her, pulling her into an embrace that felt both new and deeply familiar. "I like choosing." They fell into summer's rhythms with renewed energy. The gardens flourished under their combined care. Clara had developed an instinct for the land now, could read the plant's needs almost as well as Elias. Together they harvested beans and squash, tomatoes and peppers, herbs that filled the cabin with green fragrance. In the evenings they sat on the porch, watching the valley settle into dusk. Sometimes they talked, sometimes they played chess, sometimes they just sat in comfortable silence, shoulders touching, while the mist rose and the nightbirds called. "Tell me something I don't know about you," Clara said one evening in late July. The air was warm and thick with the scent of sage and pine. Elias thought for a moment. I used to write, he said finally. Stories mostly. When I was younger, before my father died, I'd sit up in the loft during winter and fill notebooks with adventures about people who traveled to places I'd never see. Do you still have them? Burn them. Elias's voice was flat. After my father died, I realized stories were a luxury I couldn't afford. I needed to focus on survival, on keeping the valley safe, so I burned every notebook and used the paper to start fires. Clara heard the regret underneath his practical words. That's sad. Maybe. But it was necessary. He glanced at her. What about you? What did you dream about before Iron Creek? Clara had to reach back through layers of exhaustion and despair to remember. I wanted to be a teacher, she said slowly. My mother taught me to read and write, and I thought maybe I could do the same for other children, give them something their own. She laughed bitterly. Stupid dream for a girl with no money and no connections. It's not stupid, Elias said firmly. It's just impossible, Clara finished. I know. They sat in silence for a while. Then Elias said, What if it's not? What do you mean? What if, someday when we're more secure here, we found a child who needed a home? Someone like you were, desperate and invisible. We could teach them everything, reading, writing, the valley's secrets, give them the education you wanted to provide. Clara's throat went tight. She'd never let herself think about children, about the future stretching beyond simple survival. But now, sitting in the warm evening with her husband beside her, the possibility bloomed like one of the valley's impossible green things. That's years away, she said carefully. Years we have, Elias pointed out. If we're lucky. If we're lucky. Those words haunted Clara through the following weeks. Luck was a fragile thing in the mountains. One bad winter, one curious stranger, one careless moment could shatter everything they'd built. In August, trouble found them again. Clara was checking the upper channels when she heard the bells. The early warning system Elias had installed chiming frantically in the wind. She ran back to the cabin, her heart pounding, to find Elias already loading rifles. How many? She asked. I don't know yet, but something big triggered the northwest bells. His face was grim. Could be a bear, could be men. They moved together through the forest, using the paths they'd memorized over months of practice. The bells were still chiming when they reached the ridge overlook. Below, working their way up the slope toward the hidden valley, were 4 men on horseback. Clara's blood ran cold. Prospectors? Worse. Elias's voice was deadly quiet. That's Miller and his crew from Iron Creek, the ones who run claim-jumping operations. They find isolated homesteads and force the owners to sell for nothing. How did they find us? I don't know. Elias was already calculating angles, escape routes, defensive positions. But they're an hour from the valley entrance, maybe less. Clara's mind raced. 4 armed men against 2. Even with the element of surprise and home advantage, the odds weren't good. And if they failed, if Miller's crew made it into the valley, we have to stop them, she said. Whatever it takes. Elias looked at her, his gray eyes hard. You sure about that? Once we start down this path, there's no going back. Clara thought about the gardens, the cabin, the life they'd built together. She thought about Elias's mother's letters and 30 years of careful protection. She thought about the future they'd imagined, teaching a child, building something that would outlast them both. I'm sure, she said. They split up. Elias would approach from the south, cutting off the riders' advance. Clara would take the high ground to the east, providing cover and a second line of defense. If talking failed, if Miller wouldn't turn back, Clara didn't let herself finish that thought. She just moved into position, the rifle heavy in her hands, and waited. The riders appeared through the trees, moving cautiously up the steep trail. Clara recognized Miller immediately. A big man with a scarred face and the confident bearing of someone who'd taken what he wanted his whole life. The 3 men with him looked equally hard, equally dangerous. Elias stepped out onto the trail ahead of them. That's far enough. Miller reined in his horse, one hand dropping to the pistol at his hip. Well now, if it isn't the ghost of the ridge, heard you got yourself a wife. Turn around, Elias said flatly. This land is claimed. You have no business here. See, that's where you're wrong. Miller leaned forward in his saddle, grinning. A little bird told us you've been hauling prime vegetables out of these mountains, fresh greens in the dead of winter. That got us thinking, maybe your claim is worth more than you let on. Clara's finger tightened on the trigger. From her position, she had a clear shot at Miller. One bullet, and this could all be over. But Elias was trying the peaceful route first. She had to give him that chance. There's nothing here, Elias said. Just rough land and hard work. Whatever you heard was exaggeration. Then you won't mind if we take a look. Miller kneed his horse forward. I mind. Elias didn't move, didn't reach for his weapon. He just stood there, immovable as the mountains themselves. And I'm telling you one last time, turn around. Miller's grin faded. You threatening me, Crow? I'm protecting what's mine. One of Miller's men shifted, his hand moving toward his rifle. Clara tracked him with her sights, ready. The tension stretched like a wire pulled too tight. Then Miller laughed, the sound harsh and ugly. 4 of us, 1 of you, I like those odds. He looked past Elias up the trail. Let's see what you're hiding up there. Everything happened at once. Miller's men drew their weapons. Elias's hand flashed to his rifle, and Clara pulled the trigger. The shot echoed off the mountains, and one of Miller's men jerked backward, his shoulder blooming red. His horse reared, panicked, throwing him to the ground. Next one's between the eyes, Clara shouted from her position. All of you drop your weapons, now! Miller's head whipped around, searching for her. His remaining 2 men looked uncertain, guns half drawn but frozen. Elias used their confusion to close the distance, his own rifle now leveled at Miller's chest. Do what she says. For a long moment, nobody moved. Clara could see Miller calculating odds, weighing his options. 4 men against 2, but the 2 had position and element of surprise. 1 man already wounded. The trail was narrow here. If shooting started, horses would panic and men would fall. This ain't over, Miller said finally. He raised his hand slowly, signaling his men to do the same. You can't hide up here forever. People know we came this direction. If we don't come back, then they'll assume the mountains killed you, Elias interrupted. Happens all the time. Nobody will come looking. Miller's face darkened. You wouldn't dare. Try me. Elias's voice was colder than Clara had ever heard it. I've spent my whole life protecting this land. You think I'll hesitate now? The wounded man was groaning, clutching his shoulder. Blood seeped between his fingers. Miller looked at him, then back at Elias, reassessing. All right, Miller said slowly. We'll go, but I want your word this ends here. We ride out, you let us go, and nobody speaks of this again. On one condition, Elias said. You spread the word that Elias Crow died up here. Killed by a rockfall or a bear doesn't matter. As of today, I don't exist. And anyone who comes looking for me meets the same fate as these mountains. Miller's jaw worked. Clara could see him weighing the cost of agreeing against the cost of refusing. Finally, he nodded. Done. Crow's dead, and good riddance. Get your man patched up and get out of my sight, Elias said. And Miller, if I ever see you or any of your crew within 10 miles of this ridge, there won't be a warning shot next time. Miller jerked his reins, turning his horse. His men helped the wounded one into his saddle, then they started back down the trail, moving faster than they'd climbed. Clara kept her rifle trained on them until they disappeared into the trees. Only then did she lower the weapon, her hand shaking so badly she nearly dropped it. She'd shot a man. The reality crashed over her like a wave. She'd aimed and fired and watched him fall, and she'd been ready to kill if necessary. Elias appeared beside her, pulling her into his arms. You did good, he said roughly. You did exactly right. I shot him, Clara whispered. You stopped him. There's a difference. Elias pulled back to look at her. Clara, listen to me. What you did today saved the valley, saved us. You protected what matters. Clara nodded, but the shaking wouldn't stop. Elias held her while the adrenaline worked its way out of her system, while the enormity of what they'd just done settled into her bones. They'd drawn blood to protect their secret. They'd crossed a line that couldn't be uncrossed. That night, they sat by the fire and didn't speak for hours. Finally, Clara broke the silence. Miller won't keep his word, she said. Men like that never do. I know. Elias stared into the flames. But he'll think twice before coming back. And the story about me being dead, that might actually work in our favor. If people think I'm gone, they'll They'll stop wondering about what's up here. What about me? People know I exist. You're the widow of a dead man, Elias said quietly. Probably left the mountains, went back east, disappeared into some city somewhere. That's what they'll assume. Clara thought about it. A clean break. A chance to truly vanish, to become as invisible as the valley itself. We'd never be able to go to Iron Creek again. No, we'd have to find another town for supplies. Somewhere farther away, where nobody knows our faces. Elias looked at her. That means more isolation, longer trips, greater risk of being caught if something goes wrong. But the valley would be safer. Yeah, it would. They made the decision together, sitting by the fire with their wooden rings catching the light. Elias Crow and Clara Whitmore would die in the mountains, and 2 unnamed guardians would continue protecting the valley in their place. The next weeks were tense. They watched the approaches obsessively, expecting Miller to return with reinforcements. But summer faded into autumn without any sign of trouble. The early snow came, then the heavy snows, sealing the valley off from the outside world. Winter was different this year. Instead of grinding isolation, it was a kind of cocoon, warm and safe, insulated from everything beyond the mist-shrouded peaks. Clara and Elias worked through the cold months with quiet efficiency, maintaining equipment, preserving food, preparing for spring. They played chess every evening, and Clara won more often now. They read books aloud to each other, taking turns with the volumes from Elias's father's collection. They talked about everything and nothing, childhood memories, dreams for the future, the small observations that filled their days. And slowly, carefully, they built something deeper than partnership. Clara couldn't name the exact moment she fell in love with Elias. It wasn't a sudden revelation, but a gradual accumulation. The way he always filled her coffee cup before his own, the patience he showed teaching her new skills, the fierce protectiveness that softened into tenderness when they were alone. It was in the way his hand found hers across the chessboard, the way his eyes followed her around the cabin, the way he whispered her name like a prayer in the darkness. One night in January, as snow fell thick outside and the fire crackled warm, Clara said, "I want to have a child." Elias looked up from the harness he was mending, surprise flickering across his face. "Clara, I know it's dangerous," she continued. "I know it complicates everything, but I want to teach someone the way your mother taught you. I want to build something that outlasts us." Elias set down his work, his expression unreadable. Then he crossed to her and took both her hands in his. "I want that too," he said quietly. "I've wanted it since before I married you, but I was afraid to ask." "Why?" "Because a child changes everything, makes us vulnerable in new ways, makes the valley more precious and more fragile at the same time." He paused. "But you're right. We can't just survive forever. We have to build, have to create something that matters beyond us." They didn't speak more about it that night, but the decision was made. Spring would bring new life in more ways than one. When the snow finally melted and the valley emerged green and vibrant, Clara knew she was pregnant. She told Elias on a morning in late March, standing in the garden with her hands pressed to her still flat stomach. His reaction was everything she'd hoped for, joy and fear and fierce determination all tangled together. He pulled her close and held her like she was made of glass, this woman who'd shot a man to protect their home. "We'll need to be more careful," he said. "No trips to town while you're showing, no risks we don't have to take." "I know. And we'll need supplies, things for a baby, medicine in case something goes wrong." "I know," Clara repeated. "We'll figure it out." And they did. Elias made a trip to a town 3 days south, a place where no one knew his face or his history. He came back with fabric for baby clothes, medical supplies, a book on childbirth that Clara read until she could recite passages from memory. Through the summer, Clara's body changed. She worked as long as she could, tending the gardens with Elias's increasingly worried supervision. When her belly grew too large for comfortable bending, she focused on other tasks, preserving food, making clothes, preparing the loft for a third occupant. Elias became almost obsessively protective. He checked on her constantly, insisted she rest more than she wanted, brought her food and water without being asked. At night, he'd press his hand to her swollen stomach and feel their child kick, his expression full of wonder. "My father would have loved this," he said one evening. "A grandchild, someone to carry on the work." Your mother, too, Clara added. She'd have been a wonderful grandmother. Yeah. Elias's voice was thick with emotion. Yeah, she would have. The baby came in late October during an early snowstorm that painted the valley white. The labor was long and difficult, and there were moments when Clara thought she might die, might leave Elias alone with an infant and a valley to protect. But she gritted her teeth and pushed, and Elias stayed beside her the whole time, coaching her through the pain with surprising gentleness. When their daughter finally emerged, tiny and red and screaming, Clara wept with relief and joy. Elias cut the cord with shaking hands, then wrapped the baby in soft cloth and placed her in Clara's arms. She's perfect, he whispered. You're both perfect. They named her Sarah, after Elias's mother. She had her father's gray eyes and her mother's determined chin. From the beginning, she was strong, nursing well, sleeping in reasonable stretches, alert to the world around her. The valley seemed to welcome her. The hot springs ran warm that winter, keeping the cabin comfortable even through the worst storms. The animals thrived. The stores they'd built up lasted through the lean months with plenty to spare. Clara and Elias fell into new rhythms, learning to care for an infant while maintaining the valley's systems. It was exhausting, challenging work, but it was also deeply satisfying. They were building a family now, not just surviving, creating something that would endure. Sarah grew quickly. By spring, she was babbling and reaching for everything in sight. By summer, she was crawling, getting into the garden dirt and the chicken feed with equal enthusiasm. Clara would find her in the strangest places, under the porch, in the barn, once even halfway up the ladder to the loft. She's fearless, Elias said, watching his daughter attempt to catch a chicken. Like her mother. She's going to give us gray hair, Clara countered. But she was smiling. They taught Sarah from the beginning. Simple things at first. The names of plants and animals, the sounds of the valley's rhythms. As she grew older and started talking, they taught her about the hot springs, about the importance of protection and secrecy. She absorbed it all with a child's easy acceptance, understanding instinctively that the valley was special, that it needed guarding. Why do we hide? She asked one day, maybe 4 years old, sitting on Elias's lap by the fire. Because some people don't understand how to protect beautiful things, Elias explained carefully. They see something special and they want to own it, use it up, destroy it. We hide so that the valley stays safe for people like us who know how to love it properly. Sarah nodded solemnly. I'll help protect it, Papa. I know you will, little one. I know you will. The years passed in a blur of growth and change. Sarah learned to read from the books in the cabin, to write using charcoal on smooth wood. Clara taught her numbers and history and geography, all the things she'd once dreamed of teaching other children. Elias taught her tracking and hunting, gardening and maintenance, all the practical skills that made survival possible. By the time Sarah was 8, she was competent enough to handle basic chores alone. By 10, she could field dress a rabbit and identify every plant in the valley. By 12, she could shoot as well as her mother and understood the valley's systems better than most adults could learn in a lifetime. She was also curious, asking endless questions about the world beyond the mountains. Clara and Elias answered as best they could, drawing maps and telling stories, but always with the understanding that the outside world was not for them. The valley was their kingdom, complete and sufficient. One evening, when Sarah was 13, sitting between her parents on the porch, watching the sunset paint the mist gold and purple, she asked the question Clara had been dreading. Will I ever have someone? Like you and Papa have each other? Clara exchanged a glance with Elias. They'd talked about this possibility, knew it might come. But hearing Sarah voice it made the problem real and immediate. Someday, Clara said carefully, when you're older, if we can find the right person. Someone who understands about the valley, Elias added. Someone who can be trusted with our secrets. Sarah nodded, seemingly satisfied with that answer. But Clara knew the question would return. Her daughter was growing up, developing needs and desires beyond what the valley could provide. That night, after Sarah had gone to bed, Clara and Elias discussed it seriously for the first time. We'll have to look, Elias said, carefully, the way I looked for you. Find someone desperate enough to disappear, strong enough to survive, and trustworthy enough to guard what matters. That could take years, Clara pointed out. Then it takes years. We're not rushing this. Elias's expression was firm. Sarah's happiness matters, but the valley's survival comes first. always. Clara couldn't argue with that. It was the principle they'd built their lives on. 2 years later, they found him. Elias had been making supply runs to a town 4 days west, a growing settlement where strangers were common enough that one more didn't attract attention. On his third visit, he noticed a young man working at the livery stable, quiet, competent, with the look of someone who'd been ground down by circumstances beyond his control. Elias watched him for a day, noting the careful way he handled the horses, the efficiency of his work, the wariness in his eyes. Then he approached. "You looking for different work?" Elias asked. The young man, he said his name was Daniel, looked up cautiously. "Depends on the work. Hard labor, mountain homestead, isolated, but honest pay and a chance to learn skills most men never get." Daniel studied him. "Why me?" "Because you look like you want to disappear," Elias said simply. "And I respect that." It took 3 more visits and many careful conversations before Daniel agreed to come for a trial period. Elias was upfront about the isolation, the difficulty, the absolute requirement for secrecy. Daniel listened to it all and still said yes. When Elias brought him to the valley, Sarah was 15, old enough to understand what her parents were doing, young enough to be shy about it. Daniel was 19, respectful, clearly overwhelmed by the valley's hidden beauty. "This is real?" he breathed, looking at the green terraces and steaming springs. "This all exists?" "It exists," Clara said, "and now you're part of protecting it." Daniel proved himself quickly. He was strong and willing to learn, picking up the valley's systems with impressive speed. He worked hard without complaint, asked intelligent questions, and most importantly, he understood the weight of secrecy without needing constant reminders. He and Sarah circled each other warily at first, like young animals testing boundaries. But Clara watched them gradually warm to each other, bonding over shared chores and discoveries in the valley. By the end of Daniel's first year, they were friends. By the end of the second year, it was clear they were becoming something more. Clara and Elias gave them time, watching carefully to make sure the relationship was built on genuine affection and not just proximity. But when Daniel asked permission to court Sarah properly, Elias gave it without hesitation. "You've proven yourself," he told the young man. "You've learned what it means to protect this place. And you've made my daughter happier than I've seen her in years. That's enough." They married when Sarah was 18, a ceremony by the hot springs just like Clara and Elias's had been. The valley now had 4 guardians instead of 2, a new generation committed to protection. Clara watched her daughter speak vows in the dress she'd once worn. The cream wool with its careful embroidery, passed down through 3 women now, and felt the rightness of it settle into her bones. This was what they'd been building toward: legacy, continuity, love that transcended survival. The years that followed were the richest of Clara's life. She and Elias aged together, their bodies slowing but their partnership deepening. They taught Sarah and Daniel everything they knew, passing down 35 years of accumulated wisdom. They welcomed grandchildren, 2 girls and a boy, each born in the valley and raised to understand its sacred trust. Elias died first, in his sleep one winter night when he was 67. Clara woke to find him gone, his face peaceful, his hand still warm in hers. The grief was crushing, but she was surrounded by family, Sarah and Daniel and the grandchildren, all of them mourning together, all of them understanding that Elias had died protecting what he loved most. They buried him in the valley, under a fruit tree he'd planted 40 years earlier. Clara visited the grave every day, telling him about the gardens, about the children, about how the valley continued to thrive under new guardians. She lived another 5 years, long enough to see her grandchildren grown and competent, long enough to know the valley would endure. On a warm summer evening, sitting on the porch with Sarah beside her and the sun painting everything gold, Clara simply closed her eyes and slipped away. They buried her next to Elias, under the same fruit tree. The valley mourned and then continued as it always had. Sarah and Daniel became the primary guardians. The grandchildren learned and grew. New generations would come, each one adding to the accumulated knowledge, each one choosing to protect the hidden paradise their ancestors had fought to preserve. The valley remained secret, remained safe, remained a testament to the truth that some beautiful things can survive in a hungry world if people love them fiercely enough to pay the cost of protection. And high in the mountains, where mist rose eternal from hot springs and green things grew impossible in winter, The legacy of Clara and Elias Crow endured, not in monuments or fame, but in the quiet dedication of guardians who understood that the greatest treasures are the ones the world never knows to seek. The valley lived on, hidden and thriving, waiting for those who deserved to find it, waiting to offer sanctuary to those who needed to disappear, waiting to prove again and again that love and fierce protection could create paradise in the most impossible places. And that, in the end, was enough.